5 on Isabella or the Pot of Basil. This week we're going to focus on the ending of the poem, so you need to read from where we left off last week, which was at the end of stanza 41, up to the end. So if you've already done that, you can start the lesson now, but if you haven't, take a moment or two now to read to the end of the poem, please, and then pick up the video when you're ready. Okay, so if you're ready to start the lesson, we'll start. So I just was thinking really that we've focused on Isabella, and obviously the poem's called Isabella or the Pot of Basil, but we haven't actually talked about Basil yet, and we've just really been focusing on the characterisation and the build-up of tragedy, and we haven't started to think about that other important element. So the first thing that I want you to do is list the connotations of Basil. So you might need to get your phones out or get online and do a little bit of a search about Basil as well and find out a bit more. So start with what you know and what you associate with Basil, and then take it from there, okay? And when you're ready, if you come back and we'll talk about it together, okay? Okay, so you should have done a little bit of thinking and a bit of research about Basil. Okay, so there's an example of it if you haven't seen it before. If you have seen it and if you know it well, you've probably maybe had basil with pasta or on pizza, things like that. It's really nice. So it's a herb, it's a Mediterranean herb. So things that I was thinking about and things that came up for me when I was looking online. So it's a very sensory herb, obviously. We're thinking about scent and we're thinking about taste. Okay, but some of the other connotations that it has, so we've got the idea of the kind of warmth of the Mediterranean and that kind of sensory experience, but also it has symbolism associated with love, with purity. We'll come to those ones in a moment. Summer, good wishes. So it's got these really positive connotations of love, purity, good wishes, but it also has connotations of hatred, which is interesting to have that kind of sort of confusion and juxtaposition about it. It also, for ancient Greeks, had connotations of insanity and the idea that it tempted men to madness in some way. So you might want to find out a little bit more about that, but that is relevant to us, isn't it, in terms of the madness that Isabella suffers at the end of the poem. And it's also linked with hair, because it was thought that if you ate basil, it was very good for adding lustre to your hair. So that's quite interesting as well, because in the latter stages of the poem, I think we talked about this briefly last week, there are lots of references to both Lorenzo's hair as it's kind of damaged by the clay or the mud that he's buried in, and kind of gets knotted and entwined with that, but also Isabella's hair as it hangs in her face as she digs for him in the earth, so that it kind of, they're unified in these sort of grotesque images to do with the hair at that stage of the poem. I mean, obviously we can see why it's relevant in terms of the idea of love between these two characters, but also perhaps the purity of their love, and the kind of purity of these two characters as individuals, posited against the hatred and the ill will of the two brothers. So I think you can go on and on with Basil. Actually, it does have a lot of symbolism and mythology associated with it, but I think that probably these ones are most important for us at the moment. There's some more hidden away for you here later on. We'll come back to those and talk about those ideas, which are to do with how the basil is presented in the poem. So we'll come back to this slide later on. Okay, you might want to pause the video there if you need to jot anything down. If you've got everything, we'll keep going. Okay. So the next thing that I want you to do is to just take a bit of time to answer these 3 questions. So these questions are going to make you sort of reflect on what we read and what we talked about last week before we move on. So the first question, what role does the nurse play? We talked briefly last week about her appearance in the poem and how it was kind of quite a late appearance and we'd not heard anything about her before. So what role is she playing? What function does she serve? Why does Keats bring her in now? So spend a bit of time thinking about that. Your second question is, how do you respond to the idea of Isabella being presented as hiding Lorenzo's head in the pot of basil? What does that make you think? I asked you to think about that in terms of what Keats was saying about his own work last week. So jot down your thoughts on that one. And then the third question for you to think about is, what's the significance of this line? Sweet spirit, thou hast schooled my infancy, which is what Isabella says after the vision of Lorenzo's ghost or spirit. Okay, so if you pause the video now and take a bit of time to look back at the poem, have a think about it and answer those questions, and then if you come back to me when you're ready, please. Okay, so let's go through the first question and have a look at the nurse. So I've already said this, but she makes quite a late entrance in the poem. So thinking about why Keats brings her in now is quite an important thing to do structurally. I think until this point we have viewed Isabella as being pretty vulnerable. Okay, so obviously at the beginning of the poem we find out that she lives with these two brothers, but these two brothers are not supportive to her. And we've talked already about how they seem to view her as a commodity. They anticipate making money and strengthening their status through her marriage to somebody else. And it feels like Isabella is very much alone with those two. And once we find out that those two brothers are not supportive of her and that they are conspiring to murder her lover, Isabella just seems very vulnerable, very isolated. Okay, so that's quite interesting. That's interesting to think about as well, in terms of my next point here, that she's linked with Romeo and Juliet. I've just accidentally highlighted the word Romeo there, it's not significant. So the idea of nurses being characters that figure in plays like Romeo and Juliet, and similar to the role of Angela in The Eve of St Agnes, which again makes us think about this idea of Isabella initially being presented as vulnerable, and Keats needs to do that so that we kind of feel an impending sense of doom, and it again heightens the tragedy that we feel is building throughout the play, and it heightens our sympathy for Isabella. If the nurse had appeared too early, we wouldn't have perhaps felt those feelings so intensely. But also, if you think about this nurse figure in relation to other texts like The Eve of St Agnes and Romeo and Juliet, you can see that there is this kind of tradition of these female figures who provide support, provide comfort, but also sometimes are easily manipulated and perhaps don't always do as well by their kind of young charge as perhaps you might want them to. So they're sometimes a little bit precarious, because there is, with Eve of St Agnes, we do wonder about the role that Angela has in relation to Porphyro and leading him to the chamber, and whether or not it's a betrayal, that kind of thing. So they're kind of interesting shadowy figures sometimes. Okay, so you can have a think about that further. And there's a few significant quotations that we can look at that will help us. So this first one here is interesting. And we hear that kind of intrusive voice of the narrator directing us to kind of picture the two. See, as they creep along the riverside, how she doth whisper to the aged dame. So that kind of does bring into to play this idea that Isabella does have a companion. She does perhaps have someone to confide in, but again, we just wonder at why Keats brings her in now, and that this is the first time, because we don't get a sense that Isabella has confided in anybody else at any other point. And the other interesting thing to think about, now that you've read the ending of the poem, is that she disappears after this scene. Once they've dug up Lorenzo and taken his head back, and Isabella hides it in the pot, Angela doesn't reappear, and Isabella withers away, doesn't she? So she's not confiding in anybody there and not receiving any support, but she does at this horrendous point in the poem, this really grotesque point in the forest next to his grave. She does offer support, and Isabella is able to confide in her. Another interesting quotation that connects with these two. So, what good can thee betide that thou shouldst smile again, is something that is said in stanza 44. Okay, so if you look at stanza 44, see, as they creep along the riverside, how she doth whisper to that aged dame, and after looking round the champaign wide, shows her a knife. What feverish hectic flame burns in thee, child? What good can thee betide that thou shouldst smile again? The evening came, and they had found Lorenzo's earthy bed. The flint was there, the berries at its head. So there's a kind of mania around Isabella at this point as she prepares to dig up the body of her lover. And the nurse is confused by this situation, alarmed, understandably. But and questioning what good's going to come of this, and she's fearful for Isabella and worries about her. I find this bit interesting, that thou should smile again, because it's kind of, to me, unclear whether or not Isabella is kind of a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot, sort of overwrought and has this kind of intense mania about her, and that she smiles in that. And so the nurse is frightened by that and wrong-footed by that, and is asking her what on earth's going on, what's going on inside of you and inside of your head that's actually making you behave in this way, and has brought a smile to your face again. So again, reminding us of the suffering and the misery that Isabella has been going through whilst not knowing where Lorenzo is. Or perhaps the nurse is sort of saying, what is it that we're going to do now that is going to enable you to smile again in the future? Either way, it reveals that the nurse isn't completely privy to the plans that Isabella has got that evening, and she doesn't really fully understand what's going to happen. But it's just interesting to think about the question about her smiling there. And then we've got this last quotation, which comes a little bit later on from stanza 48. That old nurse stood beside her, wondering, until her heart felt pity to the core at sight of such a dismal labouring. So she watches Isabella digging, as she digs for 3 hours, we're told. And again, this is a little sort of way of the narrator nudging us to feel a particular thing, isn't it? That we're kind of seeing things from the nurse's point of view here, and how pitiful Isabella is in her suffering and in her behaviour here at this point. So it's kind of confirming that we are right to worry for Isabella, and we are right to feel this intense pity as we watch her suffer, which obviously is a key element that's required for tragedy. So we're kind of getting a bit of a direction here from Keats as to how to feel, and perhaps to confirm our own feelings. Okay, so there's some interesting things to think about there. Okay, moving on to the second question that I asked you, which was to think about what's your response to the idea of Isabella concealing Lorenzo's head in a pot of basil. Well, you might have felt that it's quite incongruous. We've had a love story, haven't we? We've had those elements of romance, but this seems really kind of overblown. It seems not to fit. It doesn't fit with the behaviour of a young maiden like Isabella, that she would dig up the body of her loved one, cut off his head, and then conceal it in a basil pot. There's something very grotesque about it, but it kind of really doesn't fit, it jars. And again, I've got there that idea that Keats said that he felt like his poem was too smokeable, and he worried that it was too open to ridicule. Well, perhaps this is a moment where we can see why he might have thought that. But perhaps Keats is trying to show us that kind of the extreme ways that people behave, and that idea that grief and love and suffering are kind of all quite tightly woven and knit together, really, and that Keats is sort of exploring those ideas, and perhaps exploring that idea that love in itself and the feelings that people can have when in love are akin to a kind of madness, and that's an idea that's looked at in literature time and time again, really. So he's kind of really magnifying these feelings and intensifying them, but yes, there is a risk that this is too grotesque and a step too far and open to ridicule. However, it's highly symbolic, isn't it? We're not meant to take it seriously in that way. We're meant to see it as a symbol of suffering, and in keeping with tragedy, Keats is perhaps trying to present it on that idea of a scale of suffering, that this woman is enduring so much suffering and going through so much here that she would do something as huge as digging up the body of a loved one. And so we've got here that the ideas about magnitude, and there's a kind of sense of this as being something like you might expect in a Greek tragedy, and it has that kind of epic feel to it. So although she's not a tragic hero in the traditional sense, for many reasons, obviously she's a woman, and she's not a queen or anything like that, we do get a sense of scale and magnitude in some of these large gestures that Keats includes. later on in the poem. Okay, so some key quotations to think about here. A very memorable one as she digs up the body. Wherefore all this wormy circumstance? So again, all of these kinds of ideas about things being horrific and grotesque here, and obviously very gothic imagery being used at this point in the poem. There is something really interesting, isn't there, about this, because we're talking about someone who has lost someone in death, and in life people experience this in the kind of truly horrific sense of loss, and these kinds of ideas about what you might do in order to see a loved one again and to get them back. And I don't know if Keats is sort of exploring this sort of idea of how far you might go, and it's a kind of unbearable idea, isn't it? But Keats does explore, particularly in stanza 45, the idea of how far you might go. If we just have a look at stanza 45, I haven't got it on the slide for you, but if you have a look in your own copy of the poem. Who hath not loitered in a green churchyard, and let his spirit like a demon mole work through the clay soil and gravel hard, to see skull, coffined bones, and funeral stole, pitying each form that hungry death hath marred, and filling it once more with human soul. This is holiday to what was felt when Isabella by Lorenzo knelt. So it's a really very gothic, disturbing image, but anyone who's lost someone perhaps can understand the desperation to want to have them back again. And anyone who's ever stood in a graveyard and thought about the people who are buried beneath, you kind of mentally do exactly what Keats says there. Think about the kind of form that's left buried beneath the soil, the skeleton or whatever remains, and fill it once more with human soul, kind of mentally bring that person back. But Isabella goes a step further than that, doesn't she? And it is a really grotesque image, summed up by that idea of wormy circumstance and all of the references to the kind of clay body and the clay in his hair and things like that. But perhaps Keats is trying to show us the extremes of grief here and what people do. The other things, not what people do, sorry, people don't do this, but what people's kind of feelings might make them want to do or might make them think about in order to kind of have a glimpse of that person again or have a memory of that person again. The other thing to think about here is that Keats is making us think about Isabella's transgressive behaviour, and we'll talk more about Isabella next lesson. But if you think about her role in the poem and what she's been doing, she's crossing lines all the time, isn't she? She's not meant to have a relationship with somebody that her brothers don't want her to have a relationship with. She's not meant to have a relationship with someone who is of lower status than her. She's not meant to pine away from him when he goes. She's meant to just get back on with things. She's meant to follow the role that is allotted for a woman in society at that time, and she doesn't. She transgresses those boundaries, and here is the biggest transgression, isn't it? She disturbs the body, she disturbs the burial place because of her grief. Whilst I'm saying it's transgressive, she's also trying to reinstate some sort of order, isn't she? Because Lorenzo's soul does not feel at rest there because of the manner of his death and the manner of his burial. So again, there's some really, really interesting things going on here. But the other thing, amidst all of this transgressive, disturbing behaviour, is that Keats is highlighting the permanent nature of their love and the enduring nature of it. It doesn't diminish. And he quotes in the poem, "The ancient harps have said, love never dies but lives, immortal Lord." And we've got a sense of that her love is continuing and it's enduring. And again, we get that. The next one, sighing all day, and still she kissed and wept. So again, this disturbing image of this new version of her love in the final stages of the poem. And again, Keats is building up the tragedy and building up our feelings of pity and sorrow for her, but at the same time also disturbing us and making us question those feelings and making us question what we can put up with, really, and how far we're prepared to go with these images. Okay. The third question that I asked you, which maybe I should have dealt with before that bit, because this bit is a quotation from when the spirit has appeared to her and gone, and then we've leapt forward to her actually digging up his body. But she says, "Sweet spirit, thou hast schooled my infancy." So an important quotation in terms of the function of Lorenzo's spirit. Last week we talked a lot about what role ghosts and spirits play in visions in romantic, sorry, in literature across time, really, not just in romantic literature. And in this sense, it seems like it was a call to revenge, wasn't it? It was like she's been taught a lesson and now she needs to go and dig up the body and do something because on the spirit's behalf. Okay. The other thing here is that idea that the spirit has schooled her infancy, she's taught her a lesson. That's made her lose her innocence. So he's taught her a lesson which has given her knowledge, so very specific knowledge in that he is dead and that her brothers are responsible for his death, and that it was murder and this is where he's buried. So she knows those very specific facts which are important to her, but also his spirit has schooled her infancy in that this is a huge loss of innocence, that her way of looking at the world, her way of understanding people in the world has completely changed from this point onwards, and that is an important thing to think about in relation to how her mind changes in the remaining stages of the poem and how she suffers and kind of descends into a kind of madness by the final stages of the poem. Okay, so the next activity is looking at a series of quotations, and I've blocked out some words from those quotations. So your job is to guess. You can look back at your poem if you want, but that's cheating. See if you can guess what the missing words are. They're all connected. Sometimes they are the same, but not always. And you've got a quotation that's taken from the beginning of the poem, and then one that's taken from the end section of the poem. Okay, and what this should help us do is, again, to have a little bit of a look at the structural patterns that Keats is using during the throughout the poem to build tragedy. Okay, so on this slide, each third step did he pause and listened oft if he could hear his lady's something. And then another one from the beginning of the poem. Goodbye, I'll soon be back, goodbye, said she. And as he went, she somethinged merrily. And then this last one, the third one, is from the end of the poem. How she might secret to the forest high, how she might find the clay so dearly prized, and sing to it one last. Okay, so if you take a moment and insert the missing words and have a think about what connects them and what Keats is doing here with those words, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so the first one, so from pretty early on in the poem, if he could hear his lady's matin song. Okay, so those early stages of the poem when they were listening for each other, looking out for each other, all of that sensory sight and sound imagery that we've talked about a lot. And then this quotation, as he goes off for the day with the brothers to do some work, and he speaks to her before he goes. And as he went, she chanted merrily. So that sense that neither of them had a feeling of foreboding at that moment or a feeling of threat, and that they assumed they would see each other later on. So if you think about that, we've got this kind of culmination and this, sorry, not culmination, this building up of imagery related to sound and that delight in hearing each other, but also it presents their innocence, doesn't it, at that stage. And that they just expect life to kind of go on in the same routine that they've got into. And then the last one, how she might secret to the forest high, how she might find the clay so dearly prized, so the clay being Lorenzo, and sing to it one last lullaby. Okay, so we've got this bit being the culmination of the singing and the sound references, and that desire to sing one last lullaby to Lorenzo upon finding him. And obviously lullabies have connotations of sleep and singing a child to sleep, which is a really interesting thing to think about in relation to the role that Isabella plays in this poem, or the role that she was meant to play in life, and that idea that in a kind of tending to Lorenzo in finding his body and laying him to some form of rest. She's kind of acting almost as a mother figure, singing to it one last lullaby, which again is really incongruous in light of the fact that we know she is going to chop off his head and put it in a basil pot. But that kind of nurturing that goes on there through singing the lullaby is really important thing to think about. Okay, on to the next one. All close they met again before the something came and they had found Lorenzo's earthy bed. So again, you put your words in and then come back to the video when you're ready. Okay, all close they met again before the dusk. From the very beginning of the poem, those secret meetings that they have in the bower. Again, we talked a lot about this a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, about the kind of the idea that they can only meet in darkness and in secrecy, and that dusk being a sort of that tipping point between daylight and night time. And the second one from the end section of the poem, the evening came and they had found Lorenzo's earthy bed. So the irony of them meeting in dusk and night time being a time of safety and security for them to meet in, but also obviously nighttime having those kind of more sinister, threatening connotations of darkness and terrible things happening. And obviously in this very gothic scene toward the end of the poem, when she's digging up the body, it is inevitably evening when they discover Lorenzo's earthy bed. So it's kind of quite fitting, isn't it, really, that he should be found at that time. But you can see there that this earlier foreshadowing of darkness and threat is part of Keats's tragic method there, isn't it? Okay, on to the next one. Until Isabella's untouched cheek fell sick within the rose's just domain, fell thin as a young mother's who doth seek by every something to cool her something. So early imagery there. And then the second one from later on, she killed it with a lip more chill than stone and put it in her bosom where it dries and freezes utterly to the bone. Those dainties made to something and something's something. So this one from very early on in the poem, talking about the two, Isabella and Lorenzo, when they're kind of suffering because they can't say what they feel to each other, and this is just before they kind of reveal their feelings to each other. And this one from later on, when she's digging up his body and comes upon his glove, and she puts the glove in her dress, puts it to her breast. Okay, so see what you can get with those missing words, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so the first one, so fell thin as, so that should be, as a young mother's who doth seek by every lull to cool her infant's pain. And then this one here, I'm talking about where she places the glove, holds the glove to her breast and put it to her bosom where it dries and freezes utterly to the bone, those dainties made to still an infant's cries. So we've got more or less a direct repetition there, really, infant's pain, infant's cries. This idea that those dainties being breasts made to feed and comfort a baby and still them. And again, this is really interesting, particularly in light of that quote that we had there, just that idea that in finding Lorenzo's body, she can sing it one last lullaby, she can soothe Lorenzo, she can ease his pain, his suffering in death somehow, and that's a kind of mothering role. There are at least two more quite obvious instances in the poem where Keats is talking about Isabella in the role of a mother, and that idea that her function perhaps in life and the function of her body is to reproduce and to soothe children. And that again reminds us, if we think about it in more detail, it reminds us of the plans that her brothers had for her, that they wanted her to marry a man who was wealthy and had status, and that for them that would secure their wealth. But also, obviously, inevitably, part of that would be that she would then go on to produce children for him and then further secure their legacy. We've heard that the brothers have inherited their wealth, so there is a tradition of passing on wealth and securing the family name and the family sort of heritage, so perhaps bound up with all of this is some of that. But it is really interesting to stop and think about what kind of role was envisaged for Isabella and how she transgresses that role, how she crosses all of those boundaries. So you can kind of miss those lines quite easily, really, because they sort of don't initially seem to be part of the main drama of the poem, but there are really interesting clues there about the role that women are allotted and what role Isabella is meant to fulfill. So you can think about that a little bit more. Okay, on to the fourth pair of quotations. If Isabel's quick something had not been wed to every symbol on his forehead high, she's something it waxing very pale and dead, and straight all flushed, from the very beginning of the poem, just before they declare their feelings for each other, and then late on in the poem, she's something into the fresh thrown mould, as though one something did fully all its secrets tell. Clearly she's something, as other something would know, pale limbs at the bottom of a crystal well. Okay, pause the video and add your words, please. Okay, so the imagery here. If Isabel's quick eye had not been wed to every symbol on his forehead high, she saw it waxing very pale and dead and straight all flushed. So you can see we had the hearing references and the sound, the language to do with sound from earlier on, and here we've got the seeing, the sight, the eye imagery. She gazed into the fresh thrown mould, as though one glance did fully all its secrets tell. So as she digs through the earth, she can see, and everything that's happened is revealed to her as she sees the body and the remains of Lorenzo. Clearly she saw, as other eyes would know, pale limbs at the bottom of a crystal well. So she sees, as other eyes, a brother's eyes perhaps would know, they already know what's happened to Lorenzo. Again, this reminds us of the brother's eyes earlier on in the poem, who was seeing everything and working out what was going on. But again, it also reminds us of that eye imagery at the beginning of the poem, where we could see the delight that Lorenzo and Isabella took in each other's company and in seeing each other, and that they looked out for each other all the time. So again, this idea that this was there right at the beginning, and here it's culminating in looking upon Lorenzo's remains in the grave. It really emphasises to us this sense of inevitability that's there right from the beginning of the poem, which is also essential to tragedy. And all of this kind of idea of seeing him at the beginning foreshadows this horrific moment of seeing him as she looks into the earth. Although gazed is quite an interesting word, isn't it? It doesn't seem full of horror, so there's something to think about there. And the very last pair of quotes. There in that forest did his great something cease. 'Twas something cold, dead, indeed, but not dethroned. Come back when you're ready. Okay, and the missing words at this point are both the same word. So there in that forest did his great love cease. 'Twas love cold, dead indeed, but not dethroned. So from just after, from the stanza with the murder of Lorenzo, that idea that the brothers think that's an end to it, and that his great love will cease. But we get these later reminders from Keats that it's not that simple, that love doesn't end with death, that the person she loves is there, cold and dead, but their love is not dethroned. Dethrone's an interesting word, isn't it? That idea that love rules all in this remaining section of the poem. It is not dethroned, it is still the powerful element that's overwhelming Isabella. Okay, so I think you can see really with the links, you can see structural patterns, can't you? You can see that everything that Keats is setting up at the beginning of the poem is there in these moments of high drama and tension and these kind of dramatic episodes. It's all there, and you can see how he's using language and imagery early on to foreshadow these later moments, and you can see how he's building to them all the time. So it's all in terms of how structure is helping with tragedy. We've got this foreshadowing and this constant building of a sense of inevitability and doom, and that these characters cannot escape what the tragedy that lies in store for them. Okay. So next task then, have a little think about Isabella and Lorenzo's character presentation in more detail at this latter stage of the poem. So you've got words here that are used by Keats to describe Isabella and Lorenzo, and 7 of them describe Lorenzo, the rest describe Isabella. So your task is to come up with 2 lists, words describing Isabella, words describing Lorenzo, and have a think about what Keats' choice of word or phrase is achieving, and again look for any patterns, make any connections, think about tragedy. Okay, and come back when you're ready and we'll go through them together. Okay, so words to describe Lorenzo when Isabella is searching for his body when she digs him up. Okay, so we've got chill, mould, freezers, earthy bed, wormy, the clay, literally describing the mould, but perhaps also describing him as the clay, almost like he's a model now or a figure of himself in some way, and dead. Okay, so you can see quite clearly then that all of the words, I'm assuming that you were perfect at home as well there, all of the words there are connected with, well, not all of them, but most of them connected with death, and the idea of being cold and lifeless. You've also got the idea of being reconnected with nature, truly. For Lorenzo, we've had a lot of the imagery earlier on in the poem connected them both with nature, but particularly him, I think. And here he is returned to the earth in that way, the earthy bed, wormy, the clay, and kind of the mould, like that's shaped into it, I don't know. But yeah, very deathly, cold, lifeless imagery there. In contrast to Isabella here, who is presented as acting when she takes the head in anxious secrecy, and in her digging up of his body, we've heard through the language of the nurse as well, that she behaves in a way that is hectic, feverish, fervently, and she speaks of the flame within her. So this juxtaposition between the two of them is really interesting here, isn't it? They're both in completely different states, her acting in this frenzied manner, full of movement and kind of hectic, frantic pace, which we can understand and we can appreciate, can't we? But offset against the stillness and the deathly nature of him, which again contrasted from the intense feeling that they both had at the beginning of the poem, and all of that movement from the beginning of the poem when they were trying to see each other, trying to hear each other. So real clear comparison of the language that Keats is using at this point in a juxtaposition between the two. It's also interesting to note, however, that Keats then goes on to use a lot of similarities to describe the two of them here as she digs him up and as she carries his head back home. So some things for you to think about. I'm not going to talk too much about them now, but you can think about them and do a little bit more looking back through the poem. But they're connected. Sorry, I've just clicked that again. There's no importance to the word hair. They're connected through the constant references to their hair in this section as they dig them up, as his hair's full of clay, and as I was saying before, her hair is described as falling into her face and she's kind of looking through her hair. And we had that reference earlier on, didn't we, with the symbolism of basil, that it gives lustre to hair. So there's something to consider there. They're both described as pale, which is foreshadowing her death as well, isn't it? So in finding him, although on the previous activity we saw that she was full of kind of energy and frantic, frenetic pace in her digging up of him, it doesn't give her life finding him. It doesn't restore her to any kind of former state or provide satisfaction or anything like that. She is now, from this point on, described as pale and begins to wither away. The next description we get of him, in contrast to her withering, is that his head in the basil pot, with as the basil goes over it, he's described as a jewel. So this is an interesting moment, because it's the bit where he begins to thrive through the basil, becomes abundant and growing and life-giving in that respect, whereas she is withering away and she's pale and deathly. Okay, let's return to that image of the basil that we were looking at earlier on in the lesson, and our thinking about the connotations of the basil, because obviously by the end of the poem we've heard how the basil is actually used by Keats and how it's described. Just move those out of the way for a moment. So we've got all of those ideas about what basil has connotations of, and its kind of mythical associations and historic associations. And then we've got here some of the words that Keats uses to describe either the basil or Isabella in the final stage of the poem. So he uses the description sweet basil several times, and we hear how the basil flourishes and is thick and green, and again very sensuous descriptions of the basil. Its perfumed leaflets as it grows, whereas you can see in the face of the basil's abundance and life, Isabella pines away. So while it flourishes, she is described as drooping here and withering and pining. So it's her tears that she sheds, and those tears are shed out of love, aren't they? We heard earlier on that love does not end with death. In this poem it continues, and her tears come from her love for Lorenzo and her grief at his loss, and her tears water the basil, and as they do so it flourishes. So love and female love here is life-giving, isn't it? And we're kind of left with this image of the sweet basil flourishing thick and green and beautiful while she withers away. So what she gives of herself in nurturing the basil and in nurturing Lorenzo's memory takes from her. Which we talked a little bit earlier on, didn't we, about the function that she might have had in society, which was to be, as a woman, to be a mother and to give life in that way. And there's a kind of reenacting of that over by the end of the poem in her tending to and nurturing the basil. And there's just one last quotation here that when you'll know as you read the end of the poem, she rarely leaves the basil pot. She's there every day, absolutely devoted to it. And when she does have to leave it, we're told that she returns as a bird on wing to breast its eggs again. So that idea that she can never be parted from it for too long, but when she does leave, she has to come back to it as a mother bird would have to come to tend and feed its young eggs or young chicks again. So we are kind of left with this image of her withering, almost sacrificing herself, but at the same time giving life. So in some way she perhaps does fulfill that role that we said earlier on she moves away from, she deviates from, and she transgresses the boundaries of. So I keep saying some interesting things for you to think about, but there are some very interesting ideas for you to think about at the end of the poem. So hopefully we've talked about lots to get you going and to get you pondering. So have a look back at your notes, have a look back at the poem, see if there's anything that you want to add, and I'll be back again next lesson to look at the poem as a whole and to think a little bit more about this idea of Isabella and what her function is or should be. Okay, thank you very much. See you next lesson. Bye.